The State Department confirming 3 Americans are among the 4 victims of a terror attack in Jerusalem.
It is the city's deadliest attack in years. 4 people are dead and at least 7 others hurt.
The 2 Palestinian attackers died in a shootout with police. It happened at a contested religious site in Jerusalem.
We begin in Jerusalem, where at least 4 Israelis have been killed and several others injured in what police describe as a terrorist attack. 2 men armed with a pistol, axes and knives carried out the attack at a synagogue in the Nov18 neighbourhood in the west of the city during morning prayers. It's the deadliest in Jerusalem in years and is bound to ratchet up fears of sustained violence in the city, already on edge amid soaring tensions over a contested holy site. Officials say the men, both Palestinians from East Jerusalem, were later shot dead by police.
If you're asking me, they stabbed people once and twice or 3 times to make sure that they did the job. Very bad, very bad.
Now, police say the 2 attackers were Palestinians from East Jerusalem. They used knives and an axe to attack these Israelis that were in the synagogue. Now, tensions have been flaring up here in Jerusalem over the past several months, really after the war in Gaza between Israel and the Palestinians there. But also, there's been fights over religious spots here in Jerusalem.
We came to pray this morning. We were coming into the synagogue, and we heard gunshots from downstairs, and we heard 1 shot, 2 shots, and then a flurry of shots, at least 5 or 6 or 7 shots. We all ran out. We understand that somebody was killed or seriously wounded downstairs, and everybody called the police, and they came about 10 minutes later, and that's all I can tell you.
It's not immediately known if the men were affiliated with any militant group. Hamas, the militant Palestinian group that runs the Gaza Strip, has praised the attack, however, but stopped short of claiming responsibility. In the meantime, US Secretary of State John Kerry has declared the incident to be an act of pure terror. The French President, François Hollande, has also issued a condemnation.
People who had come to worship God in the sanctuary of the synagogue were hatcheted and hacked and murdered in that holy place in an act of pure terror and senseless brutality and murder. I call on the Palestinian leadership at every single level to condemn this in the most powerful terms. This violence has no place anywhere.
As I speak, terrible attacks are being committed, including in Jerusalem now, where we have learned of the attack on a synagogue with 4 Israelis killed. We must do something about this problem in the Middle East, this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But never ever accept terrorism. There is no justification for that.
Speaking from Gaza, the head of the armed wing of Hamas, Abu Ubaidah, warns Israel not to make tensions in the region worse.
The enemy will feel the full wave of the explosion because they are responsible for the delay and the undermining of long-term truce efforts.
A ceasefire in August between Israel and Hamas militants in Gaza ended weeks of fighting that left more than 2,000 people dead, most of them Palestinians. Fears of conflict spreading again sparked in Jerusalem after violence flared over access to a mosque considered holy in both Judaism and Islam. That's led to numerous deadly clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas are in Jordan, hoping to find some form of resolution.
Joining us now, Fred Fleitz, a former CIA analyst and senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. So if 2 Palestinian cousins get hold of a gun and these meat cleavers go on the attack in a synagogue, does that become one of these lone wolf terror attacks, or does it have the hallmarks of support from Hezbollah or one of the terrorist organizations over there?
John, it's good to be here. I think these attacks are driven by two things. First of all, I think they were probably inspired by calls by ISIS for Muslims worldwide to commit acts of violence against so-called enemies of their religion. But I also think these attacks are driven by the Palestinian leadership. Now, I just listened to President Obama say that President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority strongly condemned the attacks. I disagree. He also blamed the Israeli authorities for being behind these attacks, for stoking up the situation. These attacks are driven by tensions over the Temple Mount. The Israeli government had to shut down the Temple Mount last month after a rabbi who called for Israelis to have the right to pray there was almost assassinated. The assailant was killed by the Israelis, and then protests broke out. And how do Abbas respond? He called for a declaration of war because the Temple Mount was closed. Now, the Mount was reopened on Friday, but nevertheless, tensions are very high because of this situation.
Well, what are the Israelis supposed to do in cases like the Temple Mount incident and this latest attack?
Well, there's been a long time understanding that people of other faiths could visit the top of the Temple Mount, but they could not pray there. Now, there are some Jews who believe that that's unfair. That shows a lack of tolerance for their religion. They show tolerance for Islam. Islam should show tolerance for their religion. I think this difference can be worked out, and I believe that's what the Israeli government is trying to do. But it doesn't help when the head of the Palestinian Authority calls for a declaration of war of an action that the Israeli government had to take because of an outbreak of violence.
Well, let's frame this in a larger context, really. The gruesome murders that we were just talking about come as a new study reveals that terror attacks were up sharply last year, rising 44% from 2012, killing 18,000 people. What's behind this rise, Fred?
John, there are many on the left who say that we're no longer at war with terror, that we're not at war with radical Islam anymore. I think this is stunning evidence that we are. Now, the president earlier this year said that ISIS was a JV terrorist group. And in August, he said he didn't have a strategy to fight ISIS. And I think this administration has been in denial about the threat from terrorism, the threat from radical Islam throughout its administration. This is simply more data that this war is ongoing. And I got to tell you, John, when the data comes out for 2014, these figures will be much worse.
We have seen another ISIS beheading. There are a couple of Western hostages still left in ISIS hands. I just wonder, has that group lost its ability to sway the response, I guess, by continuing to kill those that it holds?
ISIS still thinks they get propaganda value out of beheadings. It's hard for rational people to understand that. But this video needs to be studied carefully. I've read some expert analysis that said it was not as well produced, and it may indicate that ISIS is on the run or they lost the location where they were able to film the last video. There's also some talk that they're running out of Western hostages, and I hope that that's true.
Well, I mean, we all hope that's true. We know that they are holding a young woman, a 26-year-old woman who, went over to help and became hostage. But they are aiming these videos at more supporters, trying to recruit more people who want to do the same kind of thing. That's what we find so unbelievable in the West.
It's hard to understand, but they are finding that these acts of horrific violence have an effect in recruiting some dispossessed and troubled individuals who, for some reason, see siding with ISIS as the way they want to lead their lives. I think it's important to launch a campaign on the internet and in the news media to explain to these people what ISIS is really about. But I think there's always going to be a small number of individuals who are susceptible to this type of propaganda.
Fred Fleitz is a former CIA analyst and a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Fred, thank you.
He was asked about the attacks in Jerusalem today. Let's listen.
It took place in Jerusalem. We know that two attackers senselessly and brutally attacked innocent worshipers in a synagogue during their morning prayers. Obviously, we condemn in the strongest terms these attacks. A number of people were wounded, and 4 people were killed, including 3 American citizens. So this is tragedy for both nations, Israel as well as the United States, and our hearts go out to the families who obviously are undergoing enormous grief right now. Secretary Kerry has spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu. President Abbas has strongly condemned the attacks. Tragically, this is not the first loss of life that we have seen in recent months. Too many Israelis have died, too many Palestinians have died. And at this difficult time, I think it's important for both Palestinians and Israelis to try to work together to lower tensions and to reject violence. The murders for today's outrageous acts represent the kind of extremism that threatens to bring all of the Middle East into the kind of spiral from which it's very difficult to emerge, and we know how this violence can get worse over time. But we have to remind ourselves that the majority of Palestinians and Israelis overwhelmingly want peace and to be able to raise their families knowing they're safe and secure. The United States wants to work with all parties involved to make that a reality and to isolate the kinds of extremists that are bringing about this terrible carnage.
Breaking overnight, a deadly terror attack shattering the peace of early morning prayers inside a Jerusalem synagogue.
They used axes and knives to attack the people.
Police say 2 Palestinian men armed with knives, axes, and a handgun entered the building in an Orthodox neighborhood in West Jerusalem. The assailants traveling from East Jerusalem, killing 4 Israeli civilians and injuring 6 others, including 2 responding police officers. This video shows Israeli police trying to enter the synagogue to stop the attackers, who were then shot and killed by police. Israeli authorities calling this one of the deadliest terror attacks in the city in years.
What you saw today is slaughter of innocent people while they're praying in a synagogue. If the world doesn't unite against terrorism and gives 0 excuses for terrorism, this will haunt the world.
A spokesman for Hamas quickly praising what happened as justifiable revenge for the death of a Palestinian bus driver found hanged in his bus Sunday. But Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas condemned the attack, as did Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying Israel will respond with a heavy hand, his office posting on his official Twitter account. This attack, the latest and most violent amid months of soaring tensions in the Holy City, with a wave of attacks and kidnappings in recent weeks.
Israel's prime minister condemning what he called the cruel murder of Jews who came to pray and threatening to respond harshly.
2 Palestinian cousins stormed the synagogue during morning prayers armed with meat cleavers and a gun. They killed 4 people praying inside before police shot them dead. Connor Powell live in Jerusalem. He has the latest on this. Connor?
Well, John, Jerusalem is no stranger to violence, but even by recent standards, today was a particularly brutal attack. And as you said, 3 Americans were killed. Another individual from Britain was also killed, and the violence showing no signs of letting up. As Jewish worshippers in Jerusalem gathered for morning prayers, the growing violence between Israelis and Palestinians arrived at the doorstep of the Har Nof synagogue. According to both Israeli police and eyewitnesses, 2 men armed with axes, knives, and pistols stormed the synagogue early this morning. They began stabbing and shooting people just as they were beginning to pray. Most were able to escape, but the attackers started to slash and shoot. At least 4 people were killed. Several others were wounded in the attack. Israeli officials say the 2 attackers were Palestinians in their 20s from East Jerusalem. Clashes between police and protesters erupted in their neighborhood soon after. Today's violence is just the latest in a series of attacks that have some fearing an outbreak of widespread violence not seen here in a decade. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel will respond harshly to these terror attacks, and he is blaming Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for inciting the violence. The problem here is that security officials say that these appear to be individual attacks and individually planned, and that they aren't linked. And their security officials here in Israel actually disagree with the Prime Minister about whether or not the Palestinians are inciting the violence. The larger issue is how to make it stop. Today, Prime Minister Netanyahu has ordered that the homes of the attackers be demolished. Whether or not that will prevent future attackers, it isn't clear, but what we do know, John, is that the tension here in Jerusalem continues to escalate.
And the White House is just out with a statement from President Obama strongly condemning the attack, as you would imagine. Connor Powell reporting live from Jerusalem. Connor, thank you.
The trouble has been you've had these extremist statements from Islamists who come with this sort of irresponsible language about the Temple Mount, and my Prime Minister has said unequivocally there will be no change to the status quo, the religious status quo on the Temple Mount.
This is just going to add to the tensions in Jerusalem, which have been simmering for weeks now, with a few other attacks that have taken place in Jerusalem, in the east of the city, also in the West Bank, in Tel Aviv, a total of 6 Israelis killed by Palestinians in those. But this is really the deadliest attack that there has been in Jerusalem, the deadliest attack of its kind for many years now.
It can't be that people pray here and are murdered. People take the train and are murdered. People in the bus are killed. Last week a soldier. These things can't be. It's frustrating to be in your country, your own city, your own prayer in your synagogue, and get killed.
Inside the synagogue there were wounded victims, some wounded from gunshots and some injured by the attacker with an axe. The scene inside is very disturbing, with lots of blood. Inside there were another 3 dead.
This really continues a drumbeat of deadly violence. What is happening there, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I think several things are significant. First, we know that Hamas has applauded the attack, has not taken credit for it. But I think we should watch developments there, because when Prime Minister Netanyahu says there will be a harsh response, obviously the question is harsh against whom? And if there are links that this was directed or inspired by Hamas, then I think we know what the Israeli retaliation will be. Second, this attack against a synagogue in a Jewish neighborhood of Jerusalem, not in East Jerusalem where the Arabs live primarily, but an attack in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood, I think intended to convey the terrorist message that no one is safe anywhere in the city. And then finally, we don't know whether the fact that of the dead 3 are Americans, 1 British apparently, whether that was a motivation. In other words, was this an attack on foreigners as well, or was it simply an attack on a synagogue that tragically killed 4 foreign citizens? But I think the implication here is very clear, that the prospect of further negotiation between Israel and the Palestinian authorities is pretty close to zero.
Yeah, meat cleavers and a gun. Israel has done a very good job in recent years at keeping suicide bombers out of Israel proper. That's why you go to a meat cleaver, as brutal as that is, because your sources in the past for killing are no longer available.
Right, and I think the fact that that they're willing to use knives and axes to have literally blood on their hands as they kill their victims is related in part to what we see in ISIS beheading foreigners, including 3 Americans. What we saw in Britain with drummer Rigby being killed in a knife attack on the streets of London. What we've seen in this country with a beheading recently. That the terrorists are clearly intending to show not only are they willing to sacrifice their own lives, they're going to commit their terrorist acts in the most bloodthirsty way they can. And I don't think you can blink this reality anymore. This isn't workplace violence. And whatever the provocation that the Palestinians may point to, there is no excuse, period, close quote, no excuse for killing innocent civilians.
And the Iranian nuclear talks continue today, too.
Very dangerous.
Keep a half an eye on that as well. Ambassador, thank you. John Bolton in New York with us.